presentation was supposed to be with a projection of some drawings that I've done with Kool-Aid, but I
messed up. I couldn't find the right adapter. I'm very sorry, everybody.
But no, that's all right. But they are up at the back of the room, so if you want to have a look at them, do you want to start that again?
No, it's fine.
So they are there, and basically the Kool-Aid. I threw myself in at the deep end with the Kool-Aid conspiracy theory. It was something that I mentioned early on to Vera when we were talking about the book club, and then I sat down to write it, and the thing is, it's far-fetched, and as I was writing it, I kept trying to like rationalise it, but it kept sort of twisting out of my hands like a trout. But it became a kind of, I couldn't tell you what it is. It's sort of a poem, but it sort of isn't. So here we go. You're supposed to make only 2 quarts of Kool-Aid for a package, but he always made a gallon. So his Kool-Aid was a mere shadow of its desired potency. And you're supposed to add a cup of sugar to every package of Kool-Aid, but he never put any sugar in his Kool-Aid because there wasn't any sugar to put in it. He created his own Kool-Aid reality and was able to illuminate himself by it. In the middle part of the last century, there were these flashbulbs of Kool-Aid realities popping in the twilight all across America. We can watch them from the safety of our cars parked at the lookout point on the dark hillside of the future, try and draw them into astrological charts with lines of coincidence running between, pin down the star map of history, walk it backwards to make sense of the swirling, widening galaxy of chaos, the particles of powder dissolving in an ever greater volume of water. We are trying and trying to concentrate, but our potency diffuses. We have or have not added sugar because there is or is not any sugar to put in it. In 1967, the same year that Trout Fishing in America came out, but 5 or 6 years after it was written, Tom Wolfe wrote a book called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. It's about the double K Ken Kesey and his merry band of pranksters, who were a sort of party, revolution, new age missionary group. They preached their acid gospel and they travelled the country in their psychedelic school bus further. You can imagine them stopping at roadsides to tie-dye their clothing with Kool-Aid, using every colour of the flavour spectrum, and then adding that to the humid heat in the bus as it passed through the love summer of American landscape. You can see the beads of sweat rolling down their necks, rolling down the backs of their thighs and mixing in the heat of their armpits with the Kool-Aid dye of their clothes into a kind of human Kool-Aid, salt, sweat reality, transferring the colours to their skin, the acid test permeating the membranes between things. They were driven by Neil Cassidy, a true Kool-Aid wino who had been driving for decades at this point, passing through Jack Kerouac's On the Road, copies of which have been used to navigate hundreds, if not thousands, of Greyhound buses of young people to San Francisco, to Mexico, to Big Sur, back and forth across America. Ultimately, Neil Cassidy died beside a railway track before the publication of Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, but he is there, and also in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Howl, and all these other notable beat works of literature. Cassidy might not have written them, but he is driving them. He was their trailblazing muse, like a Kool-Aid shooting star. So back to the acid tests. There were a series of parties that happened between 66 and 67, where the pranksters would go to often predominantly poor black areas and hire a hall, which they would wire for sound, put on a light show and a band, usually the Grateful Dead, and then on a few notable occasions they would mix acid into a huge punch bowl of Kool-Aid. They thought this was pretty profound, and Tom Wolfe certainly makes it seem like they had discovered an unholy, holy sacrament in his hysterically realist prose. But if you really want to know about Kool-Aid sacrament, then I guess we had better think about Jim Jones. Jim Jones's father was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So you have that K stapled in your mind from an early age. You have the cool with a K, Filter King cigarettes that killed Nat King Cole. You have the K of Karl Marx. And then it's not so hard to imagine a young Jim Jones sitting in the back of his non-integrated math class in Ohio in the 1940s, staring at the tips of the all-American corn-fed inbred girl who sits in front of him and has just dip-dyed the ends of her hair with this cool product that used to be called Fruit Smack. It's called Kool-Aid. And it tastes of grapes and it's bright purple, and she's used it to colour the tips of her hair. And perhaps absent-mindedly, while Jim Jones doesn't listen to the lesson on algebra, he watches her take the very end of her hair into her mouth and then wince, her face puckering like the pretty little centre of a fist at the sour, unsweetened, concentrated taste. It makes you wonder if he ever wondered if her bathwater would dilute that dip dye to the correct ratio, if he ever imagined rolling his fingers over her collarbones, her pale purple breasts, using that hand like an oar to mix a pound of sugar into her girl-skin grape bouillon bath before drinking it down in pints, drinking so much that he'd cry purple tears like a sea snail as her skin cooled to the lilac rosetti goose flesh, camphor lanterns out, cool, cooler, cold Ophelia, I drink you down like a diner milkshake. I digress. I can pretend that to be the truth about Jim Jones. I can paint him in a wash of Kool-Aid tones, or I can tell you about the church he started. It's called the People's Temple, how he took a 5-cent powder packet Bible and mixed it to his own Christian, communist Kool-Aid reality, a strange and spiritual potency in which what you need to believe in is what you can see. If you see me as your friend, I'll be your friend. As you see me as your father, I'll be your father. But for those of you who don't have a father, if you see me as your God, I'll be your God. The People's Temple was built on the basic premise of total integration, racial justice and social equality. This message was diluted and disseminated, but at its heart the people of this temple were trying to improve their lives, to build what they described as a paradise on earth. By September 1977, a decade after the acid tests and the publication of Trout Fishing in America, just under 1,000 of Jones's followers had moved into a new community in the jungles of Guyana. They had fled San Francisco in the beginning of an exodus which ultimately would take them further still. They were a different kind of school bus missionary troop, driving back and forth across California, gathering recruits, but they had a lot in common too, Jim Jones and Ken Kesey. They both had this power and charisma, these sprawling families holding on to their every word. The San Francisco headquarters of the People's Temple was less than 1 block away from the venue of the acid test graduation. They might as well have shared a parking lot. They had both wired their settlements for sound, Kesey on his farm so you could speak a word into a microphone in the house and it would reverberate through speakers hidden in the Oregon hills. And then Jim Jones, of course, his I Am Ahab pulpit sermons, his jungle pavilion from which he soothed and slurred and cooed his followers, not into an acid test. Quite the opposite, in fact, because if you mix cyanide into an oil drum of Kool-Aid, not LSD, what you get is a strong alkaline. This act was the often rehearsed White Night, the revolutionary suicide of November 18th, 1978. It was the death of 909 of his people, 606 adults, 303 children. It was the greatest singular loss of American civilian life before 9/11. As Jim Jones put it on the tape, which you can hear, he wanted his followers to die with a degree of dignity. Lay down your life with dignity, don't lay down with tears and agony. In the background of the track, behind the clear sound of tears and agony of children dying, laying down as families, you can hear the ghosting of a sad and melancholy gospel song that the death tape is recorded over. It's a far cry from the Grateful Dead. Now, it seems that in America at least, conspiracy is as much a mechanism of grief as anything else. It's a way of reconciling the mind to great tragedy by adding an element of unknowable truth that is always out there. It is a disavowal of difficult events, assuring of fragments of evidence against your ruin. It is Elvis, never dead, endless sightings, maybe even hiding in the jungles of Guyana. It is a luminous fame that outshines our belief in death. Marilyn Monroe, JFK, Michael Jackson. With this in mind then, I want to think about how Harvey Milk ties into this punch bowl of events. For those of you who might not know, Harvey Milk was the openly gay district supervisor of the Castro in San Francisco. He fought for civil rights and hope, and he and Mayor George Moscone were both supporters of and supported by the People's Temple of Jim Jones. On November 27th, 1978, 9 days after the Jonestown massacre, Moscone and Milk were both assassinated by a former member of the Board of Supervisors called Dan White. There is an easy narrative of conspiracy written into this case. Dan White's defence was hinged upon his altered mental state caused by an excessive quantity of sugar and junk food in his diet. They called it the Twinkie defence, but it might as well have been called the Kool-Aid overdose. When in office, Dan White held a position that had previously been filled by Jim Jones, and